I get really sad around the holidays, especially for some reason Thanksgiving, because it just seems like a time to be with your family, even more than Christmas or any other holiday. And I didn't hear about religious trauma syndrome until actually 2 weeks ago. I didn't even know it was a disorder until I watched a YouTube channel, and then I started watching a lot of other YouTube channels about it. I know I have that because I grew up in an extremely Catholic family, and I went to a Catholic school from grade 1 to 8. Whenever we went on any kind of road trip, or not really road trips, even like a 15 or half hour trip, my parents would make us pray the rosary. We went to church at least 3 times a week, and I didn't realize how extreme religious it was until I went to high school, where it was no longer a Catholic school. It was just a regular public school. And actually, I liked high school better, but my whole world was Catholic until I was around probably like 17 years old. And growing up from early childhood, it was nice. My parents were both professionals, and we lived in a nice neighborhood. So up till I was 8 years old, I actually had a nice family. But I think my mom was 38 when she got pregnant with my younger sister, and she started to become very abusive to me and my 2 brothers. And she started to hit us with electrical cord whenever we would do anything like that. But it was random. It was like probably hormonal, and the electrical cord would make us, gives us scabs and stuff. And I ended up telling my teacher about it in school. I was in 3rd grade, and it was the year I made my Holy Communion. And I was having nightmares that year, and my teacher got government social services involved. And my mother had to get rid of this electrical cord that she was whipping us with. And everybody blamed me because I was getting really good grades in school, and my teachers were saying that I was really smart. My mom basically thought that I was so smart that I planned it all out, that I basically concocted a plan for the government to come into our personal lives and take our children away. And so from the time I was 8 till now I'm in my late 30s, I just began a cascading life of just serious depression. And I just think maybe my mind developed like that. So the next year I dropped out of all my honors classes. I was very sad, and my dad noticed I was really sad, but my mom didn't seem to care. But she had just had my little sister, and I was happy to have a little sister. But that year I remember I started to see ghosts in my room. I would wake up with this woman with a black eye, and she would be staring back at me. She was bloody and bruised, and I would wake up, because I had a queen size bed. I would wake up to a ghost of a woman or a girl or a lady bleeding and looking back at me. And maybe my subconscious was picking up on a change in my life. So after the 3rd, 4th grade, I started to get a little bit better in maybe my 5th and 6th grade, and I started to get back into the honors classes again in middle school. And we were still going to a Catholic school, and the Catholic school was not, it wasn't worse than the high school that I went to that was public. But I did notice that the priest, they built themselves this nice big home with a whirlpool and probably luxury things, and the nuns were living in like a much less nice condition. They were living in poverty, I think. So maybe not poverty, but I don't think they treated the nuns as well as the priests. And I never really explicitly noticed, but it was implicit in our religion that maybe like once I started to hit puberty, I think that's when things got really bad for me again. And I think it was just I think the religion has a fundamental problem with women having power or being empowered. And so but I didn't realize that at the time. So when I was 13, my older brother was 1 year older than me, and he hated me for some reason. He was always getting in trouble in school. And then he was just trying to get my life to make me feel bad about myself. So he was constantly telling me that I was ugly, and constantly telling me that people didn't like me, and that he was embarrassed of me at school. And I think he would lock me up in the basement when my parents would leave. And one time I just there was a little kitchen in the basement, and I just took a knife and I just stabbed my wrist with it, because I was just like, you can't lock me up, I'll escape one way or another. And then for the next year, I think I was in 7th grade, I had a nickname at school called Slitty, because I was slitting my wrist basically. And I was suicidal. I didn't want to live. And nobody really got me suicide help because I lied about it. I said that I was just trying to outwardly show the pain that I was feeling inside. And I think that was part of it. And maybe I wasn't, I can't remember back then. I can't go back in time and remember exactly. But all I know is just from the time I was 8, I just struggled with serious depression. And this just continued on. It was like there were ups and downs. I think my parents cared more about how other people saw them than how they actually treated their own children. So I was just constantly being told that I was bad, and being accused of things that I never even thought of or wanted to do. Basically, my own parents just seemed to assume the worst of their kids. And it just seemed like if we ever had a problem, they didn't teach us to stand up for ourselves. They were just teaching us to not ask questions. I mean, really all the stuff I was reading about the religious trauma syndrome, where if you asked why, that was bad. I mean, my mother would say, what you can't ask me why, you just have to do what I say. And I think that's a terrible way to raise children, even if they're 5 years old and asking why. When children develop, maybe you can't explain certain things to them when they're 3 years old and they have to get older, but you could at least try to, so that they know why certain things are wrong or right or appropriate. And if you can't speak to their intelligence, then maybe discipline and punishment is secondary. But in my house, just punishment seemed to be just almost like an obsession. So also after the orange cord incident, when I was 8 years old, my mom started to yell at my dad because he didn't discipline us enough, and said that she was doing all the work and that he needed to be more of a dad. And by father or dad, she basically said he needed to discipline us. So my dad started to become abusive towards us. And I forgot to mention that part. He would spend hours in the basement making a board to hit us with and drill holes in it. And I was just constantly scared from the time I was 8 years old to once I got out of my house. I was scared of my dad beating me up, because I think my mom stopped being physically violent because she had gotten in trouble with social services. And so it was mainly my older brother and my dad would hit with this board. And I remember my brother sneaking into my room and at the middle of the night and just talking about how bad we felt about everything. And if my dad woke up with him in my room, he would basically start beating him. And there were a few times when my dad would be almost try to kick me down the stairs, and I would pee my pants because I was scared. And I started to call the police on my parents, but when they got there, when my dad was beating my brother up, I would call the police. But when they got to our house, we would just say it was an accident. And because my parents now had my little sister now was 2 years old or 4 years old, and so she would just say it was an accident and that we didn't mean to call them. So the police would leave, and our from the exterior, our house was nice. Our parents looked decent. We looked nice. They dressed us nice. But interior, I was so miserable growing up. And I mean, it there were ups and downs, but actually the good part was actually going to school, regardless of whether it was in grade school, middle school, or high school, because it was getting away from this family that I was terrified of. So I started to develop eating disorders once I hit like 14, 15, and then 16 going into high school, because I don't know why I just felt fat. My mom would tell me that she was skinnier than me when she was my age, so I thought it was a measure of me being fat. And I think I had body dysmorphia because I was like 105 pounds and 5'1", 5'2", and I still am the same weight almost. I'm 110 pounds now, 112 pounds, and I would end up becoming like anorexic and not eating, and then I started to become bulimic. I would take runs, and I was always jogging to try to burn off calories. It was like this developmental state of just feeling bad about myself constantly, and I didn't really have any friends. I had like two friends from the Catholic school that I went to, but once I went into high school, it was just isolating. So I remember me and my brother would see each other in the hallways at lunch, and my brother would eat lunch in the bathroom, and so would I. And I don't know, not every Catholic family takes this religion to the extreme and has children like this. I think it takes a certain type of parent too, like, or a certain type of personality. Like, some people can take certain religions and not go to the extreme with them and not have to live their life to a T with every little thing that the religion tells them to do, like, which can cause OCD, I think, and maybe that's why I developed the anorexia. But I think fundamentally the religions just have this message that God is a man, and there was this obsession with being a virgin. And once I hit puberty, I think that's what happened to me, is my mother just thought that that was all that mattered. I mean, and I had to watch out for, I couldn't be like beautiful, or I had to just be modest. And I just remember growing up, once I went to high school, there were people of other religions besides Catholic. And the people I befriended were from like Ukraine and Russia, and the Muslim woman from a Middle Eastern country. So I had more in common with cultures where women were being mistreated than I did with the American women around me. And I think there was a lot of narcissism in my family. So when I became like 16 or 17, I was trick-or-treating with my brothers, and I started to hear voices. And I am still to this day very spiritual, but I am not Christian, and definitely not Catholic. But I started to hear voices of these men that were trying to like just talk about me, like, and then they ended up following me around constantly, and I didn't know what they were. So I would be in the middle of the night, I would wake up and hear things, and I thought people were watching me with motion sensors. I became extremely paranoid, and within a few months, by February, my parents put me in a mental hospital, and they tried to diagnose me with schizophrenia, but it's not possible nowadays to diagnose a 17 or 16-year-old with schizophrenia. So eventually I just faked like I didn't hear these voices. It was just all men basically tormenting me and trying to get me to kill myself. And now that I'm older, I believe, and I learned more about matriarchy and patriarchy and the abuse that the patriarchy has in religions, I think that I was hearing like the energy of these patriarchal religions and how they were designed to oppress women. I think I was picking up on that and hearing it. But anyways, I went back home after like a month of being in this mental facility and failing all my classes because I couldn't even open up a book and read. I would be in such a state of like just turmoil in my mind. Basically, extreme religion was just garbage. It was basically polluting my mind with just constant garbage of repetitive nonsense. It was like OCDC, where if I had a thought or anything bad, I would have to pray Hail Marys and Our Fathers. I mean, I even have relics. This I mean, not all of it was bad. Like, we had godparents, and godparents were good. Like, this is a rosary for my sister's godmother, and it's made of crushed roses, rose petals. The beads are there. They look like, and it still smells like roses after 15 years. And then this is a cross for my, one of my other siblings, godfather. He was half, I think he was Asian. I don't remember what he was, Thailand and half white maybe. He was a very nice man, and it wasn't like all bad, but the actual household growing up was very dysfunctional. I couldn't function. So, anyways, after I got out of the mental hospital, my parents forced me to get therapy for, months after that for eating disorders. And my little sister was getting older at that time. I think she was around like 10 or 11 years old, and my younger brother was around like 14 or 15. And my sister started to tell me stories about my brother masturbating on her and basically ejaculating on her. And my mom was not letting my brothers, it was so religious, she wasn't letting us make friends and assimilate into our community. And so telling my psychiatrist, I didn't know what to do because I knew not to tell my mom because of her attitude towards women. It was like very old school. Like, it was really no different now that I'm older. It was no different than the Islamic religion, where when women are not virgins, they're just disowned and thrown out on the street. Really, later on, that's actually what it became. So I didn't tell my mom about it. I told my psychiatrist about it because I think my sister was like one step away from getting raped by my brother. And the psychiatrist said he was obligated by law to bring social services in. And I didn't want that to happen because I had been so traumatized when I was 8 for doing that the first time. And it was like almost like 9 years later. And the psychiatrist, I remember him saying that it wasn't normal for families to do that, and that there was something wrong with my parents and it wasn't us. And obviously that really was what was wrong, because you're not supposed to let like your prepubescent children, when they're like 14, 15, and 11, you let them make friends. You don't lock them in the house and keep them in the house and tell them that the rest of the world is evil and not let them assimilate into society. It was just hell, basically, growing up. I mean, basically suicide was an escape from this oppressive and miserable hell that was just all about punishing and how we were bad. So we had social services come a second time, and then their reaction was that either my brother or sister could not be in the same house for a while because of what was going on sexually. And my sister, I don't think, was raped by my brother or molested, but it was almost so close. He was masturbating on her, and she didn't know what was going on. She was just telling me about it. And so my mom blamed my sister. She said my sister was being promiscuous. It was her fault, and she should have known better. And that's what you do in these oppressive religions when women get raped, or like as in my other videos I mentioned it, you blame the woman and just blame the women for everything. And so, I talked to my dad, and I was like, you can't do that to my little sister because she can't feel like isolated. She's too little. So like they made my younger brother live with my grandmother for 6 months, and my grandmother was kind of really crazy when it came to religion too, because she had been molested by her stepfather when she was like 11, and she had to have a child, and nobody knows what happened to that child, or I don't know, maybe she was 12 or 13. And that was in Mexico, because my mom was Hispanic, half Native American, and my dad was mainly white, but also like there's a little Native American on that side. But so eventually this whole thing was cleared up eventually. And now that I look back on it, I realize I had a nervous breakdown from how extremely religious my parents were, and how like they just made everything about religion. I was worried about doing anything wrong, where like I would just get punched in the face or like just hurt. And it was awful growing up. So then when I started to go to college, it was a little bit better. I remember wearing a shirt like this, except it was like down to here. And I went home, and my mom just, and I came home with a friend, and my mom like ripped my shirt open and said it was promiscuous. And it was really like, so basically I developed scoliosis, like from always being hunched and feeling like I had to hide my body and be ashamed of it. And it was hell. It was basically created hell through religion. Like, there was no need to teach me about hell, because if all you focus on is mainly hell, you're just going to create hell on earth. Our world is what we focus on and give attention to. And I mean, I know there's something called toxic positivity, where you can be too positive and ignore real issues, but there's also just straight up negativity that is just so overwhelmingly toxic. It's like, why even live? Why even breathe? And so when I was in college, I was always doing really well in school unless I had mental problems in those certain instances. And so I was starting to meet men, and I was going to school for computer science, which was almost all men. And it required me to be up in a computer lab doing a lot of programming assignments and homework. And my mom was so religious. I remember when I finally met my ex-husband, the first time we hung out, we went war driving. War driving is where you would drive around in laptops and try to break into wireless networks and crack their codes. And it was just like almost like an exercise for us. We were just doing it to see if we could crack the code and how to hack into the systems. And it was kind of computer science related, but I think my parents said I had a 10 o'clock curfew, and we got stuck at a train. And then I think I got home at like 10:05 or 10:10. And when I rushed upstairs to get my computer to finish my computer science homework, because I was on the dean's list at that point, and my parents took away my computer. It wasn't there. And so I was so angry because I was trying to go to school and get good grades. And so I went downstairs and I smashed 2 dishes, and so that they would wake up and give me my computer back. And they called the police on me and threw me on the street. So I called the man that I had just went on like the computer date with, whatever it was. I thought we were just friends doing computer work. I don't know if it was a date, but he ended up becoming my boyfriend because I had nowhere to go, and I stayed in a homeless shelter. And then I ended up staying in his parents' basement for a while. And after 6 months, we eventually had sex. And he was the first man I had ever had sex with. And it was premarital sex. So it was already like wrong and evil in my parents' opinion. And then we ended up getting an apartment on the school campus. But at that point, I was a complete mess. I had a very abusive mother and father. There was way more to it. Like, when I was growing up, my mother would take my friends aside and try to turn them against me. She would tell my friends there was something wrong with me and make them treat me like that I was like, not right. And in high school, I remember I had made like a few friends. I one time took a ride with my friend's boyfriend. So it was 2 women and 1 man in the car. And my mom basically punished me when I got home because I got out of a man's car. And it was just basically overprotective of me, but it wasn't protection. It was like Britney Spears, where she was basically living in jail. It was like her conservatorship program. It was disempowering. My mother didn't want me to get a job. My mother basically didn't want me to be able to do anything. And even school, she didn't understand, because school wasn't just books at that time. We needed computers, and we were out late studying and finishing projects in labs. It wasn't just like all books. And so I just stopped talking to my family. I eventually ran off and got married at 19 after living for 6 months on campus with he was my boyfriend at the time. But I was a mess. I thought that, and growing up, my mother had married a virgin, but she always talked about it. And she would bring Fatima statues into the house, and had groups. They would all pray these novenas and just constant repetitive prayer nonstop. And everything was about, it was almost like a drug. It was almost like escaping reality. And I think my mom thought because she married a virgin that she didn't need to do anything else at all. Like she didn't need to be a good person. That's all she needed to do, and that was enough to make a marriage okay. And she was very abusive to everybody around us. And really, I can't stand my mom, but I feel sorry for her. But it's like a part of me hates her because of how abusive she was. But so and then my dad would call my mom a whore. So it was like my mom was always talking about being a virgin, the Virgin Mary, and then my dad would just call her like a whore constantly, like when they would get fights at least. So I've never went through a day of my life starting when I was probably 8 years old, and I don't remember when I was younger because I didn't really care. Of Maybe it was when I hit puberty where it was just emphasized. I never went through one single day probably without hearing the word virgin or whore. So I later learned that there's this religious complex called the Madonna whore complex or a virgin whore complex where, and it's tied to people in fundamental religion. It's tied to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, where a lot of men and women can't view themselves, or if it's a man, they can't view women as anything other than a sex object, basically. And they either view a woman as very pure and motherly and like this white being of goodness, or they view a woman, and if she's anything else, they view her almost like a prostitute or a whore. And so basically, my parents did that to me. They already had me probably labeled as a whore because I had premarital sex. And I ended up getting divorced a little bit later, but my ex was Catholic. He grew up in a Greek and Italian family, but they weren't extreme. I got along better with his mother than I did with my own mother because of how extreme religious my parents were. And I wish I would have valued my marriage more, but I think because I came from an extreme religious family, and my ex was almost the same way, very, but didn't trust me to go out, was always like worried about me. When I went back into computer science to finish the degree, he was always worried about me being with other men. And it was just the same thing. It was slightly better though, because it wasn't like there was no physical abuse, and he would not put me down to other people. He wasn't bad mouthing me. But so it was like actually a break. Being married was actually a break, but I had no clue how to handle it. I was in no mental condition to be married, coming from a very extreme religious family, because I had no wisdom and no life experiences. My childhood is almost like a blur, but I realized when I got older, after I got divorced, I moved to Chicago, and my little sister had the same problem. She was living in homeless shelters, and I just thought, like, to myself, what kind of mother and parents are throwing their daughters on the street because they think they might not be virgins anymore? I think that's absolutely insane, to be making a woman's entire value and self-worth like off of her vagina and her sexuality. It was just disgusting. And I didn't learn it. It was like I left home when I was 19, and I stopped being Catholic around that time. But it took me 10 years till I was probably about 27, where this repetitive like nonsense of waking up with like all these prayers repeating in my mind was just not a way of life anymore, because that was just garbage. It was absolute polluted garbage, filling my mind up with just junk and stuff that had no value. Just, it was like OCD. It was basically mind control. And I made my channel for slavery, and religion is a form of slavery. It's for any kind of or type of energy that wants to enslave something is going to make things about, it's going to try to control your mind before your body, because even slave owners can't be constantly whipping slaves and jailing them and fighting them physically. They brainwash them, and then from then on, they mold them to do what they tell them to do. And I realized, coming from the Indian side of my mom, I realized that religion, to especially like maybe Africans and Native Americans or Hispanics in this country is not what it is to other people, maybe because any race that comes from slavery is religion isn't used to help those people connect with God or a higher spirit. The religion is just used to enslave them and take away their personal power. And a lot of religions have not moved past, I mean, they keep people on survival mode and then they stop at the sexual control, because really the religion is not about spirituality, it's about control. The Catholic religion for me was not about learning how to love anyone else more or love myself more. It was about this outward display of showing that I was good enough, and my parents trying to show everybody how that we were good enough outwardly, but not caring about being internally good and actually being kind and loving. It was based off of just hatefully judging anybody that was doing things that were different from the Catholic faith. It was basically a living hell. And that's all I got for now, with Thanksgiving coming up, because I'm making myself sick. I've been in bed for 2 weeks just with my family calling me. So I didn't talk to my family for years, like at least 10 years. Starting from when I got divorced, I just stopped talking to my family, because my mom actually, I think, wanted me to get divorced. It was just, she just wanted all these bad things to happen to me. So my family didn't outwardly disown me after they realized I didn't want to talk to them for 5 years, but they were like extremely abusive, and I disowned them. I told myself my parents were dead because it was easier for me to cope with that than thinking that my parents were a bunch of brainwashed zombies that just follow into any kind of authoritarian, anything authoritarian, including the extreme like AMA control and Donald Trump and everything. Like my mom was always like, the only time my parents really cared about me is if I was really sick or the sexual aspect. And I learned about the 7 chakras later in Eastern medicine, and I learned the religion cut me off right here at my root and my sacral chakra, and I never developed personal power. My heart was broken. I never developed a voice like on how to speak up for myself and express myself. And I think I always had a very creative mind and a crown. I went through several healers that always told me that, but this whole area was really underdeveloped. If I'm explaining things in Eastern medicine terms, and I started to practice Buddhism, but when I realized whenever I would talk to my family, when I went through the whole human trafficking thing, I stayed with my parents for a few months. I got like deathly sick in bed for 2 weeks, and then my dad just called me 3 weeks ago to try to visit for Thanksgiving, try to get me to visit, and I started to get my lungs filled up with mucus, and I actually was physically sick. And so I just blocked my family, and I don't practice Catholicism anymore. And I sent them a letter, and I told them that the only way I'll have a relationship with them is if they stop using the words whore, virgin, and prostitute, because my brothers seem to be doing okay. I have 3 brothers, but me and my sister are absolute messes. It's very hard for us. So my conclusion is that the Catholic religion is horrible to women, and so is any religion that teaches people that God is a man and only a man, and only men can be priests, and all that stuff. Like, it's really just silencing the entire female experience, and especially a religion that makes your whole value as a woman based on your sexuality and doesn't help you develop your personal power or a sense of like love and community, like a real sense of love. And so that's all I want. Is I don't necessarily think religion is bad, but I think there's too much patriarchal religion, and then our religion is not grounded. We don't respect the earth a lot. A lot of times the devil is associated with the color red or fire and hell, and really that's your root. That's you connecting to the earth on a good level. Like a negative level would just be you stuck on survival mode and struggling to survive or being greedy and materialistic, but connecting with your root with the earth, touching the ground. I'm learning that there's a Schumann frequency, and that if you're not grounded, everybody needs a foundation to do something with. And I don't know, I just think a lot of the religious ideas of what's evil and what's good is actually completely wrong. I think the Catholic religion and even a lot of Christian religions are actually evil. And now that I practice indigenous shamanism, where it's more like worshiping, or more earth oriented, it's not just worshiping the earth, because that's in our society right now. We're kind of destroying our planet, and we need more people who value the planet. And the shift in that type of religion, at least for the time, is probably good. It's bringing balance to religious beliefs that, people want to fly to the moon, go to Mars, drive around, fly in planes everywhere. Maybe we need a little bit more earth shamanism or earth religions right now to balance things out. So maybe the Catholic religion had a place and was more positive than it was negative at certain points in time, and maybe Christianity did too. But the way I see it right now is there's absolutely no place for that garbage in my life. And yeah, I'm sick and traumatized from religion, and basically I had to live like an orphan my life because I just can't have a relationship with my parents and family.